Imagine this: you wake up in the middle of the night, and for the first time in years, there's nothing. No phone buzzing with notifications. No ambient hum of electronics. No traffic bleeding through your windows. No mental replay of conversations from earlier in the day. Just silence. Pure, complete, unbroken silence. And in that silence, something terrifying happens. You hear yourself. Not the voice you use to navigate the world, the one that orders coffee, makes small talk, negotiates deadlines. A different voice. Deeper. Older. One you've been expertly drowning out for as long as you can remember. It asks questions you've been avoiding. It surfaces feelings you've been suppressing. It reveals truths about who you are versus who you've been pretending to be. And the discomfort is so immediate, so visceral, that within seconds you reach for your phone, flood your mind with light and distraction, and successfully murder the silence before it can say anything else. In this video, we'll explore how silence transforms your inner world and why modern society has conditioned you to fear the very thing that could liberate you. Pay close attention, because what you're about to discover will fundamentally change how you understand your own consciousness. Before we go deeper, if this resonates with you, subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and share this with someone who needs to hear it. Your engagement helps spread these ideas to others seeking genuine transformation. Now, let's begin. This is the pattern of modern existence. Not occasionally, but constantly. A relentless flight from the one thing that could actually save you. Here's the paradox that should unsettle you: you live in the noisiest era in human history, yet you've never been more desperate for more noise. Every silence is an emergency to be filled. Every quiet moment is a threat to be neutralized. You play podcasts while you shower. You scroll while you eat. You sleep with television murmuring in the background. Even your thoughts, those brief moments between external stimuli, are themselves a kind of noise, an internal radio station that never signs off, broadcasting an endless stream of worries, judgments, memories, and plans. But why? Why has silence become so intolerable? Why does the absence of external sound feel like the presence of something dangerous? The obvious answer is distraction from discomfort. But that's too simple. Too shallow. Because if you look closely, really closely, at what happens in those rare moments when silence breaks through, when the noise finally stops and you're left alone with the raw fact of your own consciousness, you realize something more fundamental is occurring. In silence, the constructed self begins to dissolve. The identity you've carefully assembled from achievements, relationships, beliefs, and narratives starts to show its seams. All the stories you tell yourself about who you are and what your life means suddenly become transparent, revealed as the elaborate fictions they've always been. And beneath those fictions, there's something else. Something you don't recognize. Something that might not align with the person you've been performing as for years or decades. This is why silence feels dangerous. Not because it's empty, but because it's full. Full of truths you've been running from. Full of questions you don't want to answer. Full of a presence, your actual presence, that you've spent your entire life avoiding. Most people go to their graves having never truly met themselves. They live surrounded by noise, external and internal, that keeps them at a safe distance from genuine self-encounter. They mistake the constant narration in their heads for consciousness itself, never realizing that beneath the chatter lies something infinitely more real and infinitely more threatening to their carefully maintained self-image. But here's what you need to understand: even if it makes you uncomfortable, that thing you're running from in silence isn't your enemy. It's not the problem. The noise is the problem. The constant, numbing, thought-obliterating noise that keeps you fragmented, reactive, and fundamentally alienated from your own depth. Silence doesn't destroy you. It reveals you. And revelation, true revelation, is the most terrifying and liberating experience available to human consciousness. So ask yourself, and sit with this question in whatever silence you can bear: when was the last time you experienced genuine silence? Not the absence of sound. True silence can exist even in noise, but the absence of mental commentary, the cessation of your internal narrator, the stopping of the endless stream of thought that separates you from direct experience of reality. If you can't remember, or if the thought of even 5 minutes without distraction makes your chest tighten, then you're exactly where most of modern humanity finds itself, imprisoned by noise, terrified of silence, and completely unaware that the key to freedom has been in your hands all along. What you're about to discover will change how you understand your own mind. But more than that, it will reveal why silence, real silence, is not an absence to be feared but a presence to be cultivated. And why, in that presence, your inner world doesn't collapse. It transforms. The addiction to noise didn't begin with smartphones, though they've perfected it. It began the moment human consciousness became sophisticated enough to reflect on itself, and immediately recoiled from what it saw. Blaise Pascal understood this in the 17th century when he wrote that all of humanity's problems stem from our inability to sit quietly in a room alone. He wasn't being poetic. He was diagnosing a fundamental defect in how human beings relate to their own inner experience. Even then, centuries before Netflix and Instagram, people were filling every available moment with distraction, gambling, socializing, pursuing status, anything to avoid the confrontation that silence inevitably brings. But why is this confrontation so unbearable? What exactly are we running from? Carl Jung spent his entire career exploring this question, and what he discovered should disturb you. He found that most people are not living their own lives but rather performing a role, what he called the persona. This persona is a carefully constructed mask designed to meet social expectations, gain approval, and navigate the world without too much friction. It's not entirely fake, but it's not entirely real either. It's a compromise between who you actually are and who you need to be to survive in society. The problem is that maintaining this persona requires constant energy. You have to keep telling yourself the story of who you are. You have to keep reinforcing the identity through thought, through action, through how you present yourself to others. And this process is inherently noisy. It's a constant internal monologue of justification, explanation, and narration. Silence threatens this entire structure because in genuine silence, the persona has nothing to do. There's no audience to perform for, no situation to navigate, no identity to maintain. And when the persona stops its performance, what remains is what Jung called the shadow, all the parts of yourself you've repressed, denied, or simply never acknowledged because they don't fit the story you've been telling. This is the first reason silence feels dangerous. It brings you face to face with the disowned parts of yourself. The anger you pretend you don't feel. The desires you've labeled as inappropriate. The fears you've never admitted. The parts of your personality that contradict your self-image. In the noise of daily life, these shadow elements can be kept at bay, pushed down, ignored. But in silence, they rise. Arthur Schopenhauer approached the same phenomenon from a different angle. He argued that beneath the surface of conscious thought lies the will, a blind, insatiable force that drives all of existence. For Schopenhauer, most of human life is an attempt to either satisfy this will, which is impossible, or distract ourselves from its relentless demands, which is temporary. Noise, entertainment, busyness, these are all strategies of distraction. What Schopenhauer recognized is that when distraction stops, when you sit in silence with no external stimulation, you confront the fundamental restlessness of existence itself. You feel the wanting. The incompleteness. The vague sense that something is missing even when nothing in particular is wrong. This is not a personal failing. It's the baseline condition of consciousness. But we've built an entire civilization designed to help us never feel it. The philosopher Soren Kierkegaard added another layer to this understanding. He wrote about what he called the present age, even in the 1840s, as an era that had lost the ability to be still. He observed that people were becoming increasingly superficial, not because they were stupid, but because they were constantly in motion, constantly stimulated, never allowing themselves the depth that only comes from sustained silence and reflection. Kierkegaard understood that genuine selfhood, becoming an actual individual rather than just another copy of the collective, requires what he called inwardness. And inwardness is impossible without silence. Not physical silence necessarily, but the cessation of the constant commentary that keeps you at a distance from your own experience. Here's where it gets even more unsettling. Modern society has weaponized this fear of silence. The noise is no longer just a personal choice, it's systematically engineered into every aspect of life. Your apps are designed to prevent any moment of stillness. Your environment is optimized for constant stimulation. Even spaces that were traditionally silent, libraries, nature, places of worship, are increasingly invaded by ambient noise and digital intrusion. The psychologist Eric Fromm warned about this decades ago. He argued that modern capitalism depends on creating people who experience themselves as commodities, as products to be marketed and consumed. And this self-commodification requires constant external validation, constant comparison, constant performance. Silence is economically useless. You can't sell anything to someone who's sitting in genuine silence. They're not consuming. They're not comparing themselves to others. They're not feeling the manufactured lack that drives purchasing behavior. So the noise isn't just a personal preference or a generational quirk. It's a systematic feature of how society reproduces itself. You are kept noisy, distracted, and fragmented because a person who has achieved genuine silence, genuine self-knowledge, becomes much harder to control, predict, and exploit. Viktor Frankl discovered this in the most extreme circumstances imaginable. In Nazi concentration camps, where every external freedom was stripped away, he found that the last human freedom, the one that couldn't be taken, was the freedom to choose one's attitude, one's inner stance toward circumstances. But accessing that freedom required an ability to create inner silence even in the midst of chaos. The prisoners who maintained their humanity, their sense of meaning, were those who could retreat into an inner sanctuary of silence, a space that external noise couldn't penetrate. This reveals something crucial: silence is not just the absence of sound. It's a quality of consciousness. It's the ability to create inner spaciousness regardless of external conditions. And this ability has been systematically eroded in modern life, not through conspiracy, but through the cumulative effect of 1,000 small choices, 1,000 technological innovations, 1,000 cultural shifts that all point in the same direction, away from depth and toward surface, away from being and toward doing, away from silence and toward noise. The hidden problem is this: you've been conditioned to experience silence as emptiness, as boredom, as something to be feared and avoided. But this conditioning is a lie. Silence is not empty. It's the only space in which you can encounter what's actually real about yourself and your experience. Everything else, all the noise, all the distraction, all the constant stimulation, is a kind of anesthesia. It keeps you numb. Comfortable, perhaps, but numb. And the cost of this numbness is higher than you realize. The cost of living without silence doesn't announce itself with drama. There's no moment when you wake up and realize you've lost something essential. Instead, it accumulates quietly, like interest on a debt you didn't know you'd taken on. And by the time you notice, years have passed. Sometimes decades. Here's what happens to a mind that never experiences genuine silence: it fragments. Not in the clinical sense of dissociation, but in a more subtle, pervasive way. Your attention becomes scattered across so many simultaneous inputs that you lose the ability to hold anything with depth. You skim the surface of experience after experience, never penetrating to the meaning beneath. Your life becomes a collection of disconnected moments rather than a coherent narrative. Neuroscience reveals something disturbing about this fragmentation. Your brain physically reorganizes itself based on how you use it. When you constantly switch between stimuli, checking your phone, listening to podcasts, scrolling feeds, monitoring notifications, you strengthen the neural pathways associated with distraction while allowing the pathways associated with sustained attention to atrophy. The neuroscientist Daniel Levitin calls this continuous partial attention, and it's rewiring an entire generation's capacity for deep thinking. But the damage goes deeper than attention. Without silence, you lose access to what psychologists call the default mode network, the brain's resting state where it consolidates memories, processes emotions, and generates insights. This network only activates during quiet, internally focused moments. When you eliminate silence, you eliminate the very neural state that allows you to make sense of your experiences, to integrate them into a coherent understanding of yourself and your life. This explains a phenomenon you've probably noticed: you can be constantly busy, constantly stimulated, constantly consuming information, yet feel like nothing is actually sticking. You read articles but can't remember what they said. You have conversations but can't recall the details. You experience events but they blur together into an undifferentiated stream. This isn't a memory problem. It's a silence problem. Your brain never gets the quiet time it needs to process experience into meaning. The existential consequences are even more severe. Jean-Paul Sartre understood that human beings are fundamentally meaning-making creatures. We don't just exist, we interpret our existence, we assign it significance, we construct narratives that make sense of our place in the world. But this meaning-making requires reflection, and reflection requires silence. When silence disappears, so does your ability to generate authentic meaning. What fills the void is borrowed meaning. You adopt other people's interpretations of what matters. You pursue goals that society has designated as valuable without ever examining whether they're valuable to you. You feel emotions you're supposed to feel, want things you're supposed to want, live according to scripts you never wrote. And because you never sit in silence long enough to question any of this, you mistake this borrowed life for your own. This is why so many people experience what's often called a midlife crisis. It's not actually about age. It's the moment when the accumulated weight of living an unexamined life becomes unbearable. All those years of noise have prevented the kind of self-examination that would have allowed course corrections along the way. So the realization hits all at once: this isn't my life. These aren't my values. This isn't who I actually am. But by then, you're so invested in the persona, so embedded in the structures you've built, that transformation feels impossible. Aldous Huxley predicted this exact trap in Brave New World. He envisioned a dystopia where people weren't controlled through pain and punishment but through pleasure and distraction. In his world, everyone is kept perpetually entertained, perpetually stimulated, perpetually comfortable. And in that constant comfort, they lose the capacity for genuine feeling, genuine thought, genuine connection. They become, in Huxley's words, happy slaves. Sound familiar? You live in a version of that world now. The noise isn't forced on you, you choose it, eagerly, because the alternative feels unbearable. But the cost is the same, a kind of psychological slavery where you're free to do anything except the one thing that matters most: sit in silence with the reality of your own existence. The emotional consequences manifest in ways you might not connect to the absence of silence. The anxiety epidemic isn't just about external stressors. It's about minds that never rest, never settle, never find stillness. When your consciousness is in constant motion, your nervous system interprets this as perpetual threat. You're always scanning, always processing, always responding. Your body stays in a low-grade state of activation that, over time, becomes pathological. Depression, too, has a relationship with silence, or rather, its absence. The psychologist Thomas Joyner found that one of the key factors in severe depression is the sense of being a burden, of not mattering, of having no authentic place in the world. But how would you know your authentic place if you've never sat in silence long enough to discover who you authentically are? The depression epidemic isn't just about chemical imbalances. It's about people living lives so divorced from their genuine selves that they experience themselves as fundamentally empty. Relationships deteriorate in the absence of silence, too. Genuine intimacy requires the ability to be present with another person, to actually listen rather than just wait for your turn to speak. But if you've lost the capacity for inner silence, you've lost the capacity for genuine presence. Your relationships become transactional exchanges rather than deep encounters. You're never fully there with the other person because you're never fully there with yourself. The cultural critic Neil Postman warned that we were amusing ourselves to death, that entertainment and distraction were creating a population incapable of serious thought or meaningful discourse. He was writing in the 1980s, before smartphones, before social media, before the current level of technological intrusion into every waking moment. If he could see the present, he'd recognize that his prediction was conservative. The problem is worse than he imagined. But perhaps the most insidious consequence is this: without silence, you lose the ability to recognize that anything is missing. The noise becomes so normal, so constant, so totalizing, that you can't imagine an alternative. You might feel vaguely unsatisfied, perpetually restless, unable to shake the sense that something is wrong. But you attribute this to external circumstances, your job, your relationship, your living situation, rather than recognizing it as a symptom of inner emptiness. This is the trap's perfect design. It convinces you that the solution to your restlessness is more stimulation, more distraction, more noise. You feel anxious, so you consume content about anxiety. You feel empty, so you scroll for hours trying to fill the void. You feel disconnected, so you engage more frantically with digital connection. Each attempt to solve the problem through noise only deepens the actual problem, the absence of silence. The Stoic philosopher Epictetus taught that most human suffering comes not from external events but from our judgments about those events. But how can you examine your judgments if you never create the silent space where such examination becomes possible? You remain at the mercy of automatic reactions, conditioned responses, inherited patterns of thought that may have nothing to do with reality. Your inner world, in the absence of silence, becomes like a room you've never cleaned. Thoughts accumulate like dust. Emotions pile up like clutter. Unprocessed experiences stack themselves in corners. The chaos becomes so overwhelming that you keep the door closed, never venturing inside, living your entire life in the outer rooms of consciousness while the inner sanctum remains unexplored, unknown, and increasingly uninhabitable. This is what you're losing. Not just peace or calm, though you're losing those too, but access to your own depth. Access to the part of you that knows things your conscious mind has forgotten. Access to the intuition that only speaks in whispers, that can only be heard when everything else goes quiet. And the tragedy is that you're losing it voluntarily, moment by moment, every time you reach for distraction instead of sitting with silence. But there is a way out. And it begins with the most radical act available to modern consciousness. The rebellion. How to break free. The rebellion against noise begins not with a dramatic gesture but with a single heretical act: you choose to do nothing. Not the pseudo-nothing of scrolling mindlessly. Not the performative nothing of self-care routines designed for Instagram. Actual nothing. You sit. You close your eyes or leave them open. You allow whatever arises to arise. And you don't reach for the escape hatch the moment discomfort appears. This sounds simple. It is not simple. Within 30 seconds, your mind will begin its resistance. It will generate urgent thoughts, tasks you suddenly remember, conversations you need to have, problems that require immediate attention. This isn't random. This is your psyche's defense mechanism activating, trying to pull you back into noise before silence can reveal anything threatening. The key is to recognize this resistance not as evidence that you should stop but as evidence that you're finally doing something that matters. Every uncomfortable sensation, every urgent thought, every impulse to reach for your phone, these are not obstacles to the practice. They are the practice. They're showing you exactly how imprisoned you've been. The meditation teacher S.N. Goenka taught that the mind is like a wild horse that's never been tamed. When you first try to bring it to stillness, it bucks and thrashes and does everything it can to throw you off. But this isn't a sign of failure. It's a sign that you're actually engaging with the untamed reality of your own consciousness rather than continuing to distract it with carrots and sticks. Start small, but start consistently. 5 minutes of silence daily will reveal more about your inner world than 5 years of therapy if you're actually present for those 5 minutes. No music. No guided meditation apps. No mantras or techniques to keep your mind occupied. Just you, sitting with whatever is actually there. What you'll discover in those first sessions will probably disturb you. You'll notice how violent your thoughts are, how they jump from topic to topic with no coherent thread. You'll feel emotions you didn't know you were carrying. You'll encounter desires and fears you've been expertly suppressing. This is not a problem. This is the point. You're finally meeting the reality you've been running from. The philosopher Jiddu Krishnamurti spent his life teaching that most meditation techniques are just sophisticated forms of self-hypnosis, ways of achieving pleasant mental states that avoid genuine self-knowledge. True meditation, he argued, is simply observation without judgment, without trying to change anything, without goal or achievement. It's learning to be present with what is rather than constantly striving for what should be. This kind of presence terrifies the ego because the ego exists only in narrative, only in the constant storytelling that separates you from direct experience. When you sit in genuine silence, the storyteller eventually runs out of material. And in that gap, that brief space where the internal narrator pauses, you glimpse something the noise has been hiding: you are not your thoughts. This realization is shattering. Your entire life, you've believed that the voice in your head is you. But in silence, you discover that there's an awareness observing the voice. And that awareness, that consciousness that watches thoughts arise and dissolve, is more fundamentally you than any thought could ever be. The Zen tradition has a practice called zazen, just sitting. No techniques. No goals. No trying to achieve enlightenment or peace or anything else. Just sitting in silence, watching the mind do what it does. The brilliance of this approach is that it removes all the ways you might turn silence into another achievement, another item on your self-improvement checklist. You're not sitting in silence to become a better person. You're not doing it to reduce stress or increase productivity. You're doing it because noise has stolen your life, and you're taking it back. But here's what happens when you commit to this practice: when you make silence a non-negotiable part of your daily existence, your relationship to everything changes. Not immediately. Not dramatically. But gradually, persistently, undeniably. You begin to notice the noise more acutely. The constant background music in stores becomes jarringly obvious. The news cycle's manufactured urgency reveals itself as manipulation. The internal chatter that once seemed normal starts to sound like someone else's voice, like programming you inherited rather than chose. And as you notice the noise, you naturally start to choose it less. Not through discipline or willpower, but because it no longer satisfies. Once you've tasted genuine silence, noise becomes as obviously unsatisfying as junk food becomes to someone who's learned to eat real nourishment. The monk Thomas Merton wrote that, the true contemplative is not the one who prepares his mind for a particular message that he wants or expects to hear, but who remains empty because he knows that he can never expect or anticipate the word that will transform his darkness into light. This emptiness he speaks of isn't depression or nihilism. It's openness. It's the capacity to encounter reality without predetermined narratives. You develop this capacity in silence. And once developed, it changes how you navigate everything. Conversations become deeper because you're actually listening rather than planning your response. Decisions become clearer because you're not drowning in conflicting mental noise. Emotions become manageable because you've learned to observe them without being overwhelmed. The historical examples of those who transformed themselves through silence are striking. Marcus Aurelius, one of the most powerful men in the ancient world, maintained a daily practice of contemplative writing, creating silence amid the chaos of ruling an empire. His meditations weren't written for publication. They were his tool for maintaining inner clarity in a world designed to fragment attention. Thoreau withdrew to Walden Pond not to escape society but to discover what life felt like when stripped of society's noise. He wrote, "I went to the woods because I wished to live deliberately, to front only the essential facts of life, and see if I could not learn what it had to teach, and not, when I came to die, discover that I had not lived." These weren't men running from the world. They were men refusing to let the world's noise prevent them from encountering themselves. And their insights, born from silence, continue to transform lives centuries later. Your rebellion doesn't require a cabin in the woods or a monastic retreat. It requires a daily commitment to sit in silence despite every impulse to do otherwise. It requires the courage to face what arises when the noise stops. It requires the radical act of choosing depth over distraction in a world that profits from your fragmentation. Start today. Not tomorrow. Not when circumstances are better. Today. 5 minutes. No exceptions. No negotiations with yourself about whether you have time or whether it's the right moment. Because the truth is, there will never be a perfect time to begin. The noise will always have a reason why you should wait. But every moment you delay is another moment you remain imprisoned in the chaos, another moment you live at a distance from your own depth. The rebellion begins when you sit down, close your eyes, and refuse to run. Everything that follows, the insights, the transformation, the liberation, flows from that one simple, radical choice. But even this rebellion, as powerful as it is, only prepares you for the deepest truth. The final revelation that makes everything else suddenly clear. Here is the truth that silence ultimately reveals, the insight that renders everything else suddenly coherent. You are not discovering something new in silence. You are remembering something ancient. Beneath all the noise, beneath all the conditioning, beneath all the personas and narratives and stories you've constructed about who you are, there exists a fundamental stillness that has been there since before you learned language, before you formed an identity, before you became whatever the world has convinced you that you are. This stillness is not something you create through practice. It's something you uncover. It was always there. You just buried it. The mystics across every spiritual tradition understood this. They spoke of it in different languages. The Buddhists called it Buddha nature, the Hindus named it Atman, the Christians referred to the kingdom of heaven within, the Taoists spoke of returning to the source. But they were all pointing to the same reality, that your truest nature is not the chaos of thought but the silence that exists before thought arises. This is why silence transforms your inner world. Not because it adds something, but because it subtracts everything false until only the real remains. When you sit in genuine silence long enough, consistently enough, honestly enough, something extraordinary happens. The boundary between you and silence begins to dissolve. You stop being the person sitting in silence and become the silence itself. The observer and the observed merge. The separation that defines ordinary consciousness, the sense that you are here and the world is there, momentarily collapses. This is not mystical nonsense. This is direct experience available to anyone willing to sit long enough. The neuroscientist Sam Harris, despite being a committed materialist, acknowledges that these states of consciousness are real and reproducible. They're not beliefs to be accepted on faith but experiences to be verified through practice. What you discover in this state is devastating to the ego and liberating to consciousness. The you've been defending, promoting, and worrying about your entire life is a construct. It's real in the way a movie character is real, coherent, functional, meaningful within its context, but not real in the way you thought it was real. It's a pattern of thought that has convinced itself it's a separate entity. The philosopher Alan Watts spent his life trying to communicate this realization. He pointed out that the feeling of being a separate self, isolated inside your skull and looking out at a foreign world, is a hallucination, albeit a very convincing one. Your skin doesn't separate you from the environment any more than the banks separate the river from the river. You're a process, not a thing. A verb, not a noun. And silence lets you experience this directly. This realization doesn't make you care less about life. Paradoxically, it makes you care more. When you're no longer defending a fragile ego identity, when you're no longer constantly trying to prove your worth or maintain your self-image, you're free to engage with reality as it actually is rather than how your narratives say it should be. Viktor Frankl understood this from a different angle. He found that the people who survived the concentration camps with their humanity intact were not those who focused on their own survival but those who found meaning beyond themselves. When you transcend the noise of self-concern, when you touch the silence beneath identity, you naturally become more connected to something larger, to other people, to life itself, to what some call the sacred. But here's where it gets even more profound: silence doesn't just reveal what's beneath the noise. It reveals what the noise has been protecting you from. And that thing isn't darkness or terror or existential horror, despite what the ego fears. It's the exact opposite. What you find in the deepest silence is an okayness that doesn't depend on circumstances. A peace that exists independent of whether things are going well or poorly. A sense of being held by existence itself, of belonging to something infinitely larger than your individual story. The 13th century mystic Meister Eckhart wrote, "God is at home. It is we who have gone out for a walk." What he meant is that the fundamental ground of being, call it God, consciousness, reality, whatever term doesn't trigger your resistance, is always present, always accessible. But we've wandered away from it into the noise of conceptual thinking, into the world of problems and solutions, goals and achievements, past and future. Silence is the return home. Not to a physical place but to a state of being that existed before the journey began. This is why every spiritual tradition, despite their differences, emphasizes some form of silence, stillness, or meditation. They're not promoting relaxation techniques or stress management. They're providing a technology for transcending the limited self and encountering the infinite. And they all agree, this encounter is the most important thing a human being can do. The Trappist monk Thomas Keating taught that silence is not the absence of sound but the presence of God. Even if you reject theological language, the insight remains, silence is not empty space. It's pregnant with presence, thick with reality, dense with being. When the noise stops, you don't fall into nothingness. You fall into everything. And this changes how you live. Not through effort or willpower, but through a fundamental reorientation of consciousness. When you know, not believe, not hope, but directly know through experience, that beneath all the chaos there's unshakable stillness, you navigate life differently. Anxiety doesn't disappear, but you're no longer overwhelmed by it because you know it's weather passing through a vast sky, not the sky itself. Depression may still visit, but you're no longer identified with it because you've touched something in silence that depression cannot reach. Anger, fear, desire, they all continue to arise, but they no longer own you because you've discovered the space in which they appear and disappear. This is what the Buddhist tradition calls equanimity, not indifference, but the capacity to remain centered while fully experiencing whatever arises. And equanimity only develops in silence because silence is where you discover the center that cannot be disturbed. Rainer Maria Rilke wrote, "I want to unfold. I don't want to stay folded anywhere, because where I am folded, there I am a lie." The noise keeps you folded, compressed, limited to a tiny fraction of what you actually are. Silence unfolds you. It reveals dimensions of your being you didn't know existed. And the beauty, the terrible, wonderful beauty, of this revelation is that it's completely ordinary. You don't need special abilities or mystical experiences or years of monastic training. You just need to sit down, be quiet, and pay attention. That's it. The most profound transformation available to human consciousness requires nothing more than silence and honesty. But here's the final truth, the one that brings everything full circle: you will resist this. Even now, reading these words, part of you is already planning how to avoid the silence, how to postpone the practice, how to agree with the ideas without actually doing the work. This resistance isn't personal weakness. It's the ego's survival mechanism. The noise has kept you safe, or at least kept you comfortable, for so long that approaching silence feels like approaching death. In a way, it is. Not physical death, but ego death. The dissolution of the false self you've mistaken for your actual self. And the ego would rather do anything, endure any amount of suffering, maintain any amount of delusion, than face its own insubstantiality. But on the other side of that death is something the ego cannot imagine: freedom. Not freedom to do whatever you want, you already have that and it hasn't made you happy, but freedom from the constant tyranny of self-concern, from the exhausting project of maintaining an identity, from the prison of noise that keeps you forever at a distance from your own life. The invitation has been here all along. Silence has been waiting. Not waiting for you to become good enough or evolved enough or healed enough. Waiting for you to simply stop running, stop distracting, stop doing everything except the one thing that actually matters, being present with what is. Your inner world doesn't transform because you add something to it. It transforms because in silence, you subtract everything that was never truly yours, the borrowed thoughts, the inherited anxieties, the conditioned responses, the endless mental commentary, until what remains is irreducible, unshakable, and finally, genuinely you. So the question isn't whether silence can transform your inner world. The question is whether you're willing to be quiet long enough to discover what you actually are beneath the noise. Everything you've been searching for, peace, meaning, purpose, connection, authenticity, exists in the silence you've been avoiding. Not as a reward for practice but as the ground that's been beneath your feet all along, waiting to be noticed. The transformation isn't coming. It's here. In this moment. In the gap between thoughts. In the space you create when you finally, courageously, impossibly choose to be still. Stop reading. Close your eyes. Sit in silence. And discover what's been waiting for you all along.